It began with silence. Margaret Clitherow was not arrested for speaking out, nor for violent rebellion. She wasn't caught in the act of crime, and she didn't confess. Her crime, in the eyes of the English government in 1586, was refusing to betray what she believed and refusing to speak, and for that, they crushed her. Margaret lived in York during a time when being Catholic wasn't just unpopular, it was criminal. England had been Protestant since the reign of Henry VIII, and by the time Elizabeth I ruled, practicing Catholicism was considered an act of treason. Harboring a priest could result in execution. Even attending a secret Catholic mass could land someone in prison, tortured, or worse. Margaret knew all of this, and still, she refused to hide her faith. Her husband, John Clitherow, was a butcher and a Protestant, but he didn't stop her. Their house became a sanctuary. Behind the walls of their modest home, Margaret sheltered priests, organized secret masses, and even operated a hidden school for Catholic children. All of this done in whispers and candlelight, while spies walked the streets outside. She had been arrested before. She had spent time in prison, and each time, she returned more defiant. She didn't see herself as a rebel. She saw herself as faithful. In a world that had turned religion into law, she had chosen the law of her conscience, and that decision would become fatal. In March 1586, the authorities finally had enough. Margaret was arrested after rumors reached the Council of the North that she was sheltering Jesuit priests. A raid on her home uncovered secret chambers, hidden passageways, altar stones, and Catholic artifacts, but there was no priest inside. They had escaped. Still, she was taken into custody and charged with the most serious crime a layperson could commit at the time: harboring enemies of the crown by hiding priests. The government wanted a plea, guilty or not guilty. If she confessed, they would proceed with a standard execution, most likely hanging. If she denied the charge, they would try her in court. But Margaret knew what both paths meant. A trial would involve her children, her friends, her neighbors. She refused to let anyone else be dragged into it, so she stayed silent. She would not plead. In the twisted logic of Tudor law, silence wasn't neutrality, it was defiance. And there was a specific punishment for the kind of silence, peine forte et dure, translated as hard and forceful punishment. In plain terms, it meant being crushed to death. Pressing was rarely used in England. It was so cruel, so brutal, that even hardened courts avoided it. But Margaret's silence enraged the local council. They wanted an example, and they wanted it loud. On March 25, 1586, Margaret Clitherow was sentenced to death by pressing. She was 33 years old, a mother of 3, and she would become one of the only women in English history to die this way. They brought her to the Tyburn gallows in York, but there was no rope waiting. Instead, she was taken to a low chamber, bare, cold, and dim. She was told to remove her clothing, not just for humiliation, but because the punishment was meant to be felt fully. With nothing between flesh and stone, then they laid her on the floor. Her back was pressed against a large, sharp rock, purposely chosen to dig into the spine and shoulder blades. It was a torture position, even before the weights began. A wooden door was placed flat across her chest, and then came the stones. One by one, the executioners placed weights, massive stones, heavy metal plates on top of the door. Slowly, deliberately, with each new weight, her ribs strained and cracked. Her breath shortened. Her arms and legs were spread out, bound to keep her still, so that every pound of pressure pushed directly down through her chest. Witnesses said she never screamed. She only whispered the name of Jesus. As her ribs collapsed inward, her lungs began to crush. Her diaphragm could no longer rise. Every breath became shorter, sharper, more shallow. Her blood vessels burst. Her skin tore against the door. But still, she refused to speak. The agony lasted for around 15 minutes, long enough for her body to break, but not long enough to give the crowd what they expected: a confession, a cry for mercy, or even a scream of pain. She gave them silence, until she died. It is believed that her heart may have burst under pressure, a rare but documented occurrence in crushing deaths. Her body was so damaged that parts of her spine were said to have fractured inward. Even after she had clearly died, the executioners waited, just to be sure. Then the door was removed, and her crushed body left for public view before it was buried in secret. There was no church funeral, no public mourning. Her name, like so many others, was meant to disappear into a warning. But it didn't. Instead of vanishing into history, Margaret Clitherow became something else, something stronger. Word of her execution spread quickly, not as an act of justice, but of brutality. Even among Protestants, the method was seen as excessive, almost medieval, and it was England had burned heretics. Yes, it had hanged rebels and drawn and quartered traitors, but to slowly press a woman to death in front of officials and neighbors for refusing to utter a word, this was different. It was monstrous, and people remembered. Her husband, John, was devastated. Though Protestant himself, he never opposed her choices. He buried her quietly. Their children were taken in by Catholic sympathizers. One of her sons would later become a priest, the very thing she died trying to protect. Her family's faith would live on long after her. The Church, especially the underground Catholic movement in England, viewed her death as martyrdom, a woman of quiet devotion, who chose death rather than betray others, a woman who didn't curse her captors or beg for pity, but who faced torture with prayer and dignity. For years, her name was whispered in secret masses across England. She became a symbol not just of religious resistance, but of female strength in a time when women were expected to obey or disappear. Her story was passed between priests in hiding, written in coded journals, painted in secret. She was remembered not for what she said, but for what she refused to say. Centuries later, the Catholic Church would recognize her formally. In 1929, Margaret Clitherow was canonized as a saint by Pope Pius XI. A woman crushed in silence, now declared a sacred martyr. Her feast day was set for March 26th. Her name added to churches, her story told from altars, and her legacy preserved not by force, but by faith. But there is something haunting in the way she died, because it wasn't just a physical punishment, it was symbolic. Her silence challenged a system that demanded obedience. Her refusal to plead denied the court its power. And so they silenced her by silencing her body. Pressing wasn't just meant to kill. It was meant to crush the soul. No trial, no defense. No last words. Just slow, methodical pressure until the lungs could no longer rise. Until the bones caved in. Until her presence was reduced to weight and stone and blood. This was not justice. It was a message. And the message was clear. Speak or suffer. Confess or be crushed. Comply, or be destroyed. But Margaret Clitherow chose none of those. She chose silence, and in doing so, she broke the very logic of her executioners. Because they thought pain would force obedience, instead, pain became her final act of defiance. They thought crushing her body would end her influence, but instead, it became the reason she was remembered. They thought silence would make her invisible. But silence is often louder than screams. We remember her not for her speeches, or writings, or victories. We remember her because when every path led to betrayal, she chose the one that didn't. She chose to protect others, even at the cost of her own life. And she chose it knowingly. That's what makes her story terrifying. Not just the method, but the clarity. She knew pressing meant death. She knew the pain would be unimaginable. And she knew there would be no grave, no mercy, no justice. And still, she laid down on that stone. Still, she let them place the door. Still, she remained quiet as the weights broke her bones. Not because she wanted to die, but because she refused to destroy others to save herself. And that choice is what echoes. It echoes through history, through the walls of York, through the chambers of law and faith and power, through every system that punishes silence, through every place where obedience is demanded. With the threat of violence, It echoes because it cannot be undone. She was not a queen, not a warrior, not a general. She was a wife, a mother, a butcher's spouse. She lived a quiet life, and she died in a quiet room. But from that silence came something louder than law, louder than torture, louder than death. A legacy. This is Torture's room, where history doesn't whisper, it screams.